The Remains of the Day by Kazuo Ishiguro is one of the most singularly beautiful books ever written. And I just got through my third read of this novel, so let's talk about the bittersweet beauty of The Remains of the Day, a novel about regret and tradition. Kazuo Ishiguro is my favourite author of all time. I've read everything he has ever written, some of those things multiple times, and generally speaking, fans agree that either this or Never Let Me Go is his masterpiece. That said, ever since Clara and the Sun was first published, I do find myself dwelling on that novel a lot, and I'm very eager to reread it because I do think that Clara and the Sun will be looked on very, very favourably in terms of Ishiguro's legacy moving forward. But for now, let's talk about The Remains of the Day. In case you've never read it or never seen the admittedly brilliant film adaptation starring Anthony Hopkins and Emma Thompson, The Remains of the Day is set in 1956. Our protagonist is a butler called Mr. Stevens. And being a butler is all Stevens knows. It's all he has ever known. It is his life. It is where he began and it's where he will end. Stevens has worked the best years of his career at Darlington Hall, a beautiful old manor house in Oxfordshire. And for many of those years, he worked for a great lord. That lord has since passed away, and the house was bought by a nouveau riche American who wanted to own a slice of English history, and Stevens came with the house. But this American, Mr. Faraday, needs to return to the States on business, and he says to Stevens, hey, take a vacation. Go somewhere. You don't need to be here while I'm not here. Take the car and go for a drive. Stevens is honestly confused at this, but he accepts. And this is good timing because Stevens has just received a letter from a woman who once worked at the house with him. A woman who was once named Miss Kenton. She was the housekeeper at Darlington Hall. They worked together for a while, and eventually she got married, moved away, and now she lives in Cornwall. The two haven't spoken much in recent years, but she's just sent him a letter, and he takes the opportunity to go and visit her. So, yeah, off he goes. He takes a drive across the country from Oxford to Cornwall, and that drive lasts a few days. He stops at certain places along the way, meets people, has various conversations, but mostly flashes back. This is a story almost told in reverse. As he drives along, he tells us, the reader, about his life, about his philosophy, about the world that he knows. It's a very simple setup, a very simple premise, and it's one of those books where not a lot happens, but it's a real page-turner. It's 250 pages, and you'll rip through it in a day or two. Because you want to understand Stevens, you get lost in his mind. To many of us, he is kind of an alien creature. The way that he thinks, the experiences that he's had, the world he has lived in. It's something that a lot of us can't really understand. Not just because it's old now, but because it's a world that hasn't existed for quite a long time. Arguably, it's a world that stopped existing long before 1956, and that is part of the thematic crux of The Remains of the Day. Stevens is a relic. He comes from a time that no longer exists, but he's flesh and blood. When I first read it, he got me thinking about that old adage that elderly people say when they're being racist or sexist or something terrible. And they'll start their sentence with something like, well, back in my day. But this is your day. You're still alive. Your blood is pumping. You are still a part of this world, and you can learn, you can grow. They use it as an excuse, and I've never taken it as one. When I first read this novel a good few years ago, I thought about that quite a lot. As I said, Stevens is a relic, but there's so much more to him than that. I've read this book 3 times, and each time I come away thinking more about Stevens and what he represents. As I said at the beginning, this is a novel about regret. That is kind of at the forefront of everything. Stevens is off to visit this Miss Kenton, and it is very, very clear from the prologue of this novel that she is the one that got away. Miss Kenton went off and got married, and as we go on reading, we see that there was something between the two of them, but you'd almost never know it given Stevens' professionalism, given the sacrifice he makes of his entire life, of his personality, of his emotions, to his job, to his role in a world that doesn't even matter. But there is something in him, something he will never admit, something he cannot speak to, something that he arguably doesn't even realize is there. This feeling of regret. He is compelled to go see Miss Kenton, who is now Mrs. Ben. He wants to talk to her. We don't know what they're going to say. We're sure that when the book ends, he will arrive there, they will talk about something, who knows what will happen next. And obviously I won't spoil it, but he's on a journey to see her, and that journey is fueled by regret, something that he never ever says, because Ishiguro is a master of what is not said. He tells you so much about his characters, his protagonists, and there is so much that you never know for sure about them, but it is crystal clear. There is so much empty space between the words in an Ishiguro novel, and that empty space is loud, it is clear, it is vibrant. So much of what is not said feels louder than what is said. And the big thing that's not said is regret. Stevens has regrets. He doesn't know it, he will never admit it, he will not acknowledge it, but they are there and they fuel everything he says, thinks and does at this point in his life. And the way that we see all of that is through the flashbacks that he chooses to explore. But it's through these flashbacks that you see all of the other themes start to build up. They bubble beneath the surface until they burst out and become very clear. Themes of tradition and hierarchy, themes of class, this thing that Stevens keeps talking about, dignity. Over and over again, Stevens talks about dignity, that thing that makes a butler what he is, this almost indefinable quality that he wants to define, and we sit there and listen while he tries to explain dignity. He talks about his father, who was also a butler, explaining that this really is a world that Stevens knows inside and out, but that means he knows nothing else. He was raised by a butler, he became a butler. His father was cold and distant and taught him nothing but butling, or whatever the verb of being a butler is. Stevens talks to us at the beginning about various famous butlers and what made them so great. Did they have that spark of what he calls dignity? He's trying to define it and he's struggling, and he talks about his own experiences. He talks about his father. He tells stories that his father told him. And at no point do we feel like we're getting any closer to this thing called dignity. Instead, Stevens speaks about tradition and hierarchy and roles. He talks about great men. And this is in itself a toxic and poisonous thing, the idea that there are great men, no mention of women at all, and then there's everyone else. And the great men include the lords and the kings, those who were born into authority. And if you know anything about Ishiguro, you'll know that he is a master of the unreliable narrator. Never Let Me Go is perhaps the most famous example of that. Pale View of Hills, Artist of the Floating World, all of these novels have unreliable narrators, and Stevens is an interesting case in that regard. Because in some ways, The Remains of the Day is a kind of retelling of Ishiguro's second novel, An Artist of the Floating World. They are very, very similar books, exploring identical themes with similar protagonists, and both are set just after the events of World War II. The only real difference being one is set in Japan and the other is set in England. Ishiguro is a British author who was born in Nagasaki, and he and his family moved to England when he was 5 years old. And so he's written about both places, and if you read these two books, you can see that they really are the same thing. The Remains of the Day feels like a remake of An Artist of the Floating World. It retells that story and it does it better. It explores those themes in a more sensitive but also more subtle way. And the unreliable narrator is different, because in An Artist of the Floating World, the unreliable narrator is our protagonist, and what he's being unreliable about is his own life and his family and his personal and professional history. But in this, Stevens isn't being unreliable when it comes to himself. He is purely honest. To a fault. But there are things he chooses not to talk about. As the novel goes on, we learn more about the Lord for whom he worked for so many years, and how this Lord changed as time changed, as politics changed, as the zeitgeist and the landscape of Europe shifted through the two world wars. We spend so much time with Stevens in his memories during these times. He admits to us early on that some of his memories are getting confused. He was told a a thing but can't remember who told him. So we know he's unreliable because memory is unreliable. That's not his fault. He's not deceptive. But there are things that he withholds from us. Things that eventually come to light. Things that shift the very world that he was working in and living in such fascinatingly clever and subtle and brilliant ways. And everything we uncover relates again to these themes of hierarchy and tradition and regret. Stevens is a tragic character. He missed so much. He misunderstands so much. He is so naive about so many things. Over and over again throughout the novel, he talks about how it's not his place to get involved in certain things. It's not his place to speak up. It's not his place to even understand. He mentions very early on that there were things his father never learned, never understood, but it didn't matter because it wasn't his place. His father was a perfect butler. He was a machine. He knew how to be perfect within his role, within his box, within that framework. And Stevens, it's pretty clear, thinks a little bit higher of himself in terms of his intelligence. He clearly knows more than his father, but what does that mean exactly? Knows more about what and how? He still knows so little, and he has missed out on so much because of that. But this theme of regret, I really thought about it so much when I first read it. But then on my second and third reads of The Remains of the Day, I thought less about the regret. On my second read, I thought a lot about tradition. I thought a lot about this world that Stevens has only ever known and yet just doesn't matter anymore. And it speaks to so little on a broader scale. And on this third read, I've thought a lot about position, about hierarchy, about the idea of a person's place and what any of that really means. As you read this book, again and again and again, certain themes just take pride of place in your mind. First it was regret. Then it was tradition. Now it's hierarchy. They're all connected, they're all there, and I focused on each one during each read of this novel. Makes me wonder how many more times I can read it to gain more insight into this character and his world. But The Remains of the Day is also a beautiful, beautiful novel in its writing. Ishiguro speaks through Stevens, and as a narrator protagonist, Stevens is one of a kind. The way that he talks is unmistakably butlerish. Right from the beginning, there's almost a dark comedy element to him. As he talks, as he writes, as we read and listen, you kind of feel the urge to giggle at the way that he delivers what he says. There is a silliness to Stevens. There is so much propriety to him that is cringe and awkward and silly. It's goofy to us. It's goofy to so many people. He's out of touch, he's out of place. It feels like he's vibrating on a different frequency to everybody else. He's wrong, he's out of place. And he continues to talk with this dignity, with this stiff upper lip propriety, and you laugh all the way through it. But there is one moment that I actually want to read out because it hit me so hard and it is so tragic. About 1/3 of the way through the novel, there is a flashback to a very important evening where a lot of important things politically were happening in Darlington Hall. Lord Darlington is hosting a few different people from different countries and they're discussing politics at a very key moment. But a few months prior to this, Stevens managed to get his father recruited onto the staff. His father is in his 70s, his boss recently died, and so Stevens' dad needs somewhere to work. Stevens is the butler here, and so he manages to get his father hired on as the under butler, but he's really old and he's struggling, he's making mistakes, he's dropping things, he's getting injured, and now he's sick and dying. This is an evening where downstairs all of these politicians and attachés are all discussing things, very important things. Stevens is serving them and doing his job as the most important worker in this household, and his father is dying upstairs. No one knows it. Lord Darlington doesn't know it, and the visiting dignitaries don't know it either. And it's at this moment where we see Stevens in his most tragic state. It's him feeling vulnerable and refusing to show it. I can barely put it into words. I'm just going to read it to you, but fair warning, this is a really sad moment. Someone addressed his lordship, and he turned away to reply. I was about to continue further around the room when I caught sight of Miss Kenton through the open doorway, signalling to me. I began to make my way toward the doors, but before I could reach them, Monsieur Dupont touched my arm. "Butler," he said, "I wonder if you would find me some fresh bandages. My feet are unbearable again." "Yes, sir." As I proceeded towards the doors, I realized Monsieur Dupont was following me. I turned and said, "I will come and find you, sir, just as soon as I have what is required." "Please hurry, Butler. I am in some pain." "Yes, sir. I'm very sorry, sir." Miss Kenton was still standing out in the hall where I had first spotted her. As I emerged, she walked silently toward the staircase, a curious lack of urgency in her manner. Then she turned and said, "Mr. Stevens, I am very sorry. Your father passed away about 4 minutes ago." "I see." She looked at her hands, then up at my face. "Mr. Stevens, I'm very sorry," she said. Then she added, "I wish there was something I could say." "There's no need, Miss Kenton. Dr. Meredith has not yet arrived." Then for a moment she bowed her head and a sob escaped her. But almost immediately she resumed her composure and asked in a steady voice, "Will you come up and see him?" "I'm very busy just now, Miss Kenton." "In a little while, perhaps." "In that case, Mr. Stevens, will you permit me to close his eyes?" "I would be most grateful if you would, Miss Kenton." She began to climb the staircase, but I stopped her, saying, "Miss Kenton, please don't think me unduly improper in not ascending to see my father in his deceased condition just at this moment. You see, I know my father would have wished me to carry on just now." "Of course, Mr. Stevens. To do otherwise, I feel, would be to let him down." "Of course, Mr. Stevens." That is one of the saddest scenes I think I've ever read in a novel, and I think it's a wonderful example of what is not said being just as important as what is said. The phrase deceased condition kind of wormed its way through me as I read that. It is a kind of inhumane way to talk about anyone, especially one's father, but that is Mr. Stevens. That is the role he takes. That is how he must speak in order to fulfill that role, which he deems his purpose, his reason for being. If he doesn't talk that way, if he doesn't behave that way, then he is nothing in his own eyes. And it's a really, really tragic moment. His duties mean more to him than he does, than his own feelings, than his own family, than his own experiences. Those 2 pages right there are tragedy. Beautiful, beautiful tragedy. I could go on talking for hours about this novel. I have done. This is my 3rd time reading it, and every time I talk to people about this book because there is so much bittersweet beauty in Stevens as a character. He is a tragic hero in so many ways and for so many reasons, and as I said, every time I read this book I think about a different theme in relation to Stevens and his place in everything. This is a book about a man out of time. It's a book about tradition and hierarchy and regret and so many other things besides. I look forward to the next time I read it a year or 2 from now. I always learn more. This is Kazuo Ishiguro's masterpiece. A tragic tale of a butler living his life. I love it so much. Subscribe for books.